Miss Marple and the Letter Without Ink. Chapter 1. It was the sort of day that made one forgive England's usual dampness. Gossamer Vale was wrapped in late spring sunshine, and the vicarage garden had come alive with pastel bunting, polished lemon, cakes, and the murmurs of village gossip carried on a gentle breeze. Tea flowed freely in porcelain cups, and Mrs. Amelia Thorne, ever the hostess, fluttered about like a lavender-scented butterfly, fussing over jam spoons and sponge density. Miss Marple, in a soft grey cardigan and a hat that hadn't seen much, sun since the last Queen's birthday, sat quietly beneath the shade of an elm. Her needles clicked gently in her lap, though the blue wool thread remained untouched. Her gaze, however, wandered far and wide, resting momentarily on fluttering hems, poorly concealed glances, and a brief exchange near the cucumber sandwiches that made her eyebrow rise almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Henshaw dropped a fork. Reverend Plumstead gave a thin laugh that did not quite reach his eyes, and young Emily Fletcher, radiant in pale green, whispered something to her aunt that caused the older woman to stiffen slightly. The whole affair, to a casual observer, was charming. But Miss Marple's gaze had already begun collecting inconsistencies, cataloguing unsaid words and glances too brief for anyone else to notice. And then came the oddity, small, nearly invisible, but unsettling in its own right. It arrived at the garden party just as the gramophone began to wheeze out Greensleeves, a pale blue envelope delivered by hand, though no one saw by whom. Mrs. Thorne discovered it on the tea-table, nestled between a stack of napkins and the sugar bowl. "Now what's this?" she asked aloud, picking it up. There was no stamp, no address, only her name in elegant but curious handwriting, an inkless scrawl that shimmered oddly when tilted toward the sun. "That's quite strange," murmured Mrs. Thorne, frowning. "It looks written, but it isn't. Not with any pen I know." Curiosity bloomed, and a circle gathered as she opened the letter. But inside was nothing, just blank paper, heavy and thick, with no visible text. A prank, perhaps, offered Major Draycott with a snort. Silly nonsense, children playing tricks. But Miss Marple did not look amused. She leaned forward slightly, examining the envelope as it passed hands. "A letter without ink," she said quietly, "or one meant to be read only by certain eyes." Nobody laughed. The moment passed, conversation resumed, and the gramophone wheezed on. But the mood had shifted, ever so slightly, like a lace curtain twitching in a room one believed to be still. Mrs. Thorne remained distracted for the rest of the afternoon. The vicar stumbled during grace, and Miss Marple, though her hands resumed their knitting, never once looked down at her lap. Later that evening, just before dusk settled over, Gossamer Vale, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Thorne to return a borrowed embroidery pattern. She was shown in by the maid, but found the drawing-room dark and unoccupied. A teacup lay half-finished. The blue envelope sat on the mantelpiece, now marked by a faint smudge, as if someone had touched it with a gloved finger dampened ever so slightly. By the time Miss Marple left the vicarage, the lamp by the lane had begun to flicker uncertainly in the evening breeze. The birds had fallen silent, and though nothing truly frightening had occurred, there was a tension in the air, as if something had begun, quietly and deliberately, and would not now be stopped. Chapter 2. By morning, the letter had become law. The post office. Mrs. Maplecroft insisted she'd seen a boy in a cap deliver it, though he didn't look local. At the bakery, the envelope was described as ghost-written, a phrase coined by young Mr. Penrose, whose imagination outpaced his sense. And at the vicarage, Mrs. Thorne remained in her sitting-room, pale and withdrawn, her morning tea untouched and her toast going cold. "It's nothing," she told Reverend Plumstead when he inquired gently. "Only a silly jest, meant to amuse." But her voice lacked conviction, and the vicar, awkward with emotion, chose not to press further. He instead busied himself with his sermon notes, though he wrote the same sentence 3 times before giving up entirely. Meanwhile, in the heart of the village, Miss Marple sat at her usual table at the Green Finch tea-room, adding milk to her, tea in small, careful swirls. Across from her, Miss Hartnell leaned in. "It's put her quite out of sorts, you know. Mrs. Thorne doesn't usually miss her turn at the flower stall, rain or shine." Miss Marple stirred once, twice, then set, her spoon down. "I rather thought she looked pale yesterday," she replied. "Pale and distracted. Did you notice how she kept touching her wrist?" "Her wrist?" Miss Hartnell blinked. "No, I can't say I did." "She wasn't wearing her bracelet," Miss Marple said quietly. "The one with the silver clasp. She always wears it. I believe it was a gift from her late husband." Miss Hartnell frowned, but said nothing. The bell above the tea-room door jingled just then, and young Emily Fletcher entered, cheeks flushed, gloves in hand. She hesitated a moment upon seeing the 2 women, then made her way to the counter. "Coffee, please, and a scone." Miss Marple offered a pleasant nod as Emily passed, but noted how the girl's eyes flicked to the newspaper tucked under Miss Hartnell's arm, the one bearing the headline, "A Mystery at the Vicarage." "That child's been restless ever, since the garden party," Miss Hartnell murmured. "A bit high-strung, don't you think?" Miss Marple did not answer. Her gaze had shifted to the window, where Major Draycott was walking past with unusual purpose, a briefcase in hand. He wasn't a man fond of errands, or briefcases, particularly not on Wednesdays. The rest of the morning unfolded with the uneasy rhythm of a village holding its breath. Conversations tiptoed around the subject of the letter while dancing ever closer to it. No one claimed to have written it. No one admitted to knowing its contents. Yet everyone seemed convinced it meant something dreadful. By midday, even the grocer had weighed in. "Invisible ink," he muttered to Mrs. Perry while weighing apples. "War trick, you know. Lemons or heat bring it out. Maybe someone's having a bit of fun. Or maybe—" He stopped short as Miss Marple entered the shop, her basket neatly tucked on her arm. "Good day," she said with a pleasant smile. "Ah, good day, Miss Marple," he replied, adjusting his apron. "Lovely weather, eh?" "Yes, quite. I wonder, could I trouble you for a lemon?" "Of course, of course." She selected one herself, weighing it gently in her palm before placing it into her basket. As she turned to leave, she caught sight of Mrs. Henshaw outside, pretending to examine the flower pots in the window. When Miss Marple stepped out, their eyes met, and for a brief moment something flickered across the woman's face. Not quite fear, not quite guilt, but the ghost of both. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said hastily, brushing imaginary dust from her sleeve. "I didn't see you there." "Quite all right, dear. Just doing a bit of shopping." Mrs. Henshaw smiled. "Too quickly. You've heard the nonsense about that letter, I'm sure. Ridiculous, really. Is it?" Miss Marple's tone was gentle. "I suppose that depends on who wrote it. Well, no one knows that, do they?" Her laugh was brittle. "Some village prank. Boys, perhaps." "Perhaps, Miss Marple," replied mildly, "though I doubt a boy would use such refined stationery, or possess handwriting that precise." Mrs. Henshaw's hands twitched. "I must be off. Things to prepare for the Women's Guild, you know." As she walked briskly away, Miss Marple allowed herself the faintest narrowing of her eyes. There were threads here, thin and tangled, yes, but beginning to form a pattern. The bracelet, the smudge on the envelope, the girl with too much colour in her cheeks, the woman too eager to dismiss what hadn't been asked. Back at the vicarage, Reverend Plumstead finally convinced his wife to lie down for a short rest. But when he passed the sitting room later, he found the fireplace burning. A strange choice, given the warmth of the day. A soft curl of smoke drifted from within. On the hearth, a scrap of blue paper lay curled and blackening at the edge, just out of reach of the flame. He stared at it for a moment, before quietly closing the door. Chapter 3. By Friday morning, the atmosphere in Gossamer Vale had shifted from idle curiosity to something more brittle. Gossip whispered with caution rather than glee. The letter had not been mentioned in the parish post, but its absence was louder than any headline. Miss Marple took tea with the vicar that morning, not by appointment, but as a matter of gentle intrusion. She had brought a jar of damson preserve, and placed it modestly on the tray, as Mrs. Thorne remained upstairs, indisposed, according to the maid. Reverend Plumstead looked worn. His collar sat slightly askew, and the sermon notes near his elbow had gone mostly untouched. "I do hope Amelia finds rest," Miss Marple said kindly, spreading jam with delicate care. "The heat can be so taxing, especially when one is burdened by worry." The vicar gave a tired smile. "She's always been sensitive to disturbances, Miss—" Marple took a small sip of tea, watching the steam rise. "And the letter?" she asked mildly. "Did it reappear?" Plumstead blinked. "Pardon?" "The envelope. It was on the mantelpiece when I left the other evening." "Oh, no, I believe it was misplaced." Miss Marple said nothing for a moment, then gently pressed. "Strange, isn't it, for a person to destroy something they claimed held no meaning?" He looked away, his hand resting near the untouched buttered toast. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "meaning lies not in the words written, but in the knowledge of who might have written them." Miss Marple inclined her head. "A wise thought, Reverend. Indeed, the truth often sits just outside the text." She left the vicarage soon after, passing Mrs. Henshaw in the lane, who offered a tight-lipped nod before hurrying off in the opposite, ancient direction. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the back of her coat, noting how one glove had been misbuttoned. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple unfolded a square of linen on her writing desk. She placed the lemon beside it and, with quiet precision, removed a small, nearly invisible scrap of blue paper from her knitting basket. It was the edge she had noticed burning in the vicarage fireplace. A corner torn hastily, overlooked as the rest turned to ash. She held it under the flame of her reading lamp, carefully tilting it, then dabbed it lightly with the edge of a cloth. soaked in lemon juice. Nothing appeared. And yet, the texture of the paper had changed slightly. The fibres, previously smooth, now revealed a subtle indent, like the echo of a message written with pressure, but no ink. A letter never meant to be read by sight. Miss Marple turned the paper over. In the lower corner was something more tangible, the faint impression of a symbol, circular, perhaps a crest or monogram, barely visible unless one knew where to look. That afternoon the Women's Guild gathered at the hall to discuss floral arrangements for the upcoming church fete. Conversation fluttered between lilies and hydrangeas, though more than one pair of eyes flicked toward Mrs. Thorne's empty seat. Emily Fletcher arrived late, her hair slightly tousled, her gloves misaligned. She excused herself with a vague murmur and settled beside Mrs. Perry, who offered her a lukewarm smile. Miss Marple, seated near the window, busied herself with a needlepoint of roses, but watched the girl discreetly. Midway through the meeting, Miss Hartnell announced a request for volunteers to help reorganize the storage room behind the altar. "I can assist," Emily said quickly, a little too quickly. "If no one minds." Miss Marple's eyes didn't move from her stitching. "Lovely," said Miss Hartnell. "We do appreciate the energy of the young." But when the meeting ended and the ladies rose to leave, Miss Marple found herself beside Emily at the coat rack. "You've been helpful lately, dear," she said softly. "I imagine Mrs. Thorne must appreciate the support. She's had such a difficult week." Emily turned, startled. I suppose." "Of course," Miss Marple continued, folding her shawl. "It's hard to be near someone suffering, especially when one knows more than they're allowed to say." "I don't know anything," Emily said quickly, too quickly. "Nothing at all. I see." Miss Marple nodded, as if that settled the matter. "Though I must confess, I'm quite curious. Who uses monogrammed paper with the initials A.T.? Seems terribly old-fashioned these days." Emily's lips parted slightly, then closed. "I've never seen such paper." "Neither had I," Miss Marple replied, fastening her brooch. "Until Tuesday." She left without another word, letting the silence do its work. By nightfall, Emily had walked the long way home, passing by the vicarage gate 3 times before entering her own. Miss Marple, meanwhile, returned to her sitting room, lit a single lamp, and resumed her knitting with quiet deliberation. The impression on the paper still puzzled her, not the symbol itself, but the fact that someone had tried so carefully to preserve its absence. Chapter 4. By Saturday, the village had drawn its own conclusions. Theories bloomed with all the subtlety of dandelions in spring, and at the centre of many whispered suppositions stood one name, Mr. Giles Renfrew, the late husband's former business associate and, by all accounts, a man of unpredictable temper and dwindling fortunes. "It's obvious, isn't it?" said Mrs. Maplecroft in the queue at the butcher's. "That poor woman received some kind of threat, and now she won't come down from her room. Who else but Renfrew would have cause to stir things up?" "Exactly," muttered Mrs. Perry. "I saw him lurking by the vicarage gate the night after the garden party. Had no reason to be there." "And didn't he invest in that dreadful development in East Merton?" added Mr. Cresswell from behind the counter. "Lost a fair sum, I'd wager." Miss Marple, who had only come in for a bit of lamb shoulder, said nothing. She merely noted how easily suspicion found its footing in the soil of resentment. Later that afternoon, Renfrew was spotted at the King's Head, nursing a pint and a cigarette, his cravat loosely knotted and his expression grim. Emily Fletcher passed by the window and hesitated, watching him. Her reflection in the glass hovered beside his figure like a ghost. Inside, Renfrew drained his glass and waved off the landlord's offer for another. He seemed not so much drunk as deeply preoccupied. When Miss Marple entered moments later, he looked up, startled, then gave a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Miss Marple," he said, "come to join the Inquisition?" "I wouldn't dream of it," she replied pleasantly. "Though I do wonder, Mr. Renfrew, whether you've ever had occasion to use monogrammed stationery." He blinked. "What an odd question." "Life is full of oddities," she said, settling into the chair opposite him without waiting for permission. "Your initials are GR, of course, so you wouldn't be the AT from the other day." His frown deepened. "Is that what this is about? That damned letter?" "Oh, I wouldn't damn it just yet," Miss Marple murmured, though some seem rather eager to see it forgotten. Renfrew lit another cigarette, hands steady. "I've written no letter, invisible or otherwise. And if Amelia thinks I had, well, she's more paranoid than I gave her credit for." "You knew her husband well?" "Well enough. We did business before he died. Harold had investments in all manner of things. Things that went sour?" He gave her a look. "Are you accusing me of something?" Miss Marple smiled. "Certainly not. I'm merely interested in how money and its loss shapes friendships and loyalties." Renfrew exhaled smoke through his nose. "If you must know, I lent Harold money. Quite a bit, in fact. Was never repaid. After his death, Amelia washed her hands of it. Claimed she knew nothing. It rankled." "I imagine it did," she said softly. "Debts have long memories." He stubbed out the cigarette. "If someone wants to ruin Amelia Thorne, it isn't me, though I can't say I'd mind watching her squirm." Miss Marple inclined her head, as if that, too, was perfectly understandable. When she left the pub, the air outside was damp with the promise of rain. The sky had shifted, bruised clouds creeping slowly over the village, their approach unhurried but certain. Across the green, Emily Fletcher stood beneath the awning of the sweet shop, arms folded, watching Miss Marple. She did not wave. Instead, she turned and walked away, her steps brisk. That evening, news broke that the vicar had summoned Inspector Cray from the county. A move both overdue and mildly scandalous. "He's hoping to quiet the whispers," said Mrs. Perry over supper. "But really, once the police are involved, it's all but confirmed something awful's happened." "Why call them now?" asked Mr. Cresswell, pouring more tea. "No one's been killed." "Not yet," she muttered. Well, Marple, who had heard the news through a note slipped discreetly into her knitting basket, made no comment. But she sat in her parlour longer than usual that night, watching the rain tap softly against the glass. She'd seen red herrings before, whole baskets of them. Mr. Renfrew might be unpleasant, but something in his indignation rang oddly true. A man bitter, yes, but careless? No, and certainly not sentimental enough to write a monogrammed threat on custom paper. And Emily? The girl's anxieties ran deeper than youthful nerves. Her reaction to the initials AT had not gone unnoticed. nor had the fact that Mrs. Henshaw had failed to appear at the Women's Guild luncheon entirely. The social fabric of Gossamer Vale was beginning to fray. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, stood and crossed to the writing desk. She opened a drawer and removed a small silver magnifying lens, one gifted long ago by a cousin in Sussex. The monogram on the torn paper had begun to surface again, faintly now under the right light, like something trying to return to the world. It was not a flourish of initials, she now realized, but a seal, a family crest, deliberately pressed into paper meant to conceal, and one she had seen before. Chapter 5. The village green had returned to its usual stillness. The church bell tolled, solemn and measured, summoning the faithful beneath a soft grey sky. Pigeons fluttered from rooftop to spire, and a quiet mist clung to the hedgerows, but beneath the surface of Gossamer Vale's calm, an unease rippled. Inside St. Mildred's, Reverend Plumstead stood at the pulpit, his sermon measured but distracted. Miss Marple, seated 2 pews from the front, observed not the vicar, but the congregation. Emily Fletcher arrived late, sliding into her seat with a lowered head. Her aunt, Mrs. Penelope Whittaker, barely acknowledged her. Mrs. Henshaw was conspicuously absent, as was Mr. Renfrew, though the former's absence drew more subtle glances than the latter's. When the hymns ended and the congregation spilled out into the churchyard, Miss Marple lingered by the old yew tree, her gaze wandering, not idly, but deliberately. "Odd, isn't it?" murmured Miss Hartnell beside her. "How quiet everything's gone." "It's the kind of silence that means someone's planning something, if you ask me," Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Or hiding something." That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Whittaker's cottage under the pretext of returning a borrowed cookery book. The conversation turned, as expected, to Emily. "She's been sulking for days, Mrs." Whittaker said sharply, stirring her tea with unnecessary force. "Moody as a cat in fog. And ever since that ridiculous letter, well, she's been worse. I told her to mind her manners and stay out of whatever trouble Mrs. Thorne's managed to stir. She must be very devoted," Miss Marple said gently, "to offer so much help at the vicarage, especially with Mrs. Thorne being so unwell." Mrs. Whittaker sniffed. "Nonsense. Amelia always needs an audience for her dramatics. That girl gets too easily swept into other people's grief." Miss Marple let the silence hum for a moment before casually adding, "Do you know, I've always found family crests fascinating, so old-fashioned, so particular. I once saw one pressed into wax on a will. It belonged to a lady named Althea Tregennis." Mrs. Whittaker froze. "Tregennis?" she repeated slowly. "Good heavens, that name hasn't surfaced in years. You knew her?" "My husband's cousin married a Tregennis boy. The family had property in Cornwall. Lost most of it to gambling and foolish ventures. There was a daughter, Althea, yes, but she disappeared after some scandal." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Scandal? A rather delicate one. Involved a gentleman, perhaps 2, and a child, if I recall correctly. Quite the blot on the parish." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "I imagine someone like that might have reason to stay hidden." Mrs. Whittaker shrugged, "or reinvent themselves entirely." That evening, back at her cottage, Miss Marple returned to the scrap of paper she'd rescued from the vicarage fireplace. Beneath the magnifying lens, the faint imprint had fully emerged now. a crest bearing a coiled serpent and a half-wreath of thorns, distinctly Cornish, unmistakably old. She laid it beside a letter she had kept in an old box, sent decades ago by a girl named Althea Tregennis, seeking shelter in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple had not seen her again, but the handwriting, the tilt of the A, the narrow loop in the T, they were unmistakable. And there it was, the link no one else had seen. Amelia Thorne was not born Amelia Thorne. She had once been Althea Tregennis. Miss Marple folded the papers gently and placed them in a small velvet pouch. The revelation was not yet a solution, but it was the beginning of a trail long buried, and now, at last, beginning to rise from the earth. Across the village, Emily Fletcher stood at her bedroom window, staring down the hill toward the vicarage. Her fingers twitched near the curtain, and her breath left a small circle of fog against the glass. Her aunt's voice called her to supper, but she didn't move. Down the lane, Inspector Cray arrived at the vicarage gate. His coat was damp from the rain, and his manner brisk. Reverend Plumstead greeted him at the door with a furrowed brow, and led him in without a word. Inside the sitting-room, Mrs. Thorne, Amelia, or perhaps Althea, sat in her armchair, silent and pale, her hands wrapped tightly around a teacup she never drank from. Outside, unnoticed, Miss Marple passed by the garden fence, pausing only to examine the freshly turned soil near the rose-bed. A glint caught her eye, something small, metallic, and out of place. She knelt, brushing the dirt aside, a broken clasp, silver, familiar, the bracelet, the one Mrs. Thorne hadn't worn at the garden party. Chapter 6. Monday morning brought a subtle shift to Gossamer Vale. The mist lingered longer than usual. Conversations, once light and perfunctory, now hung with unspoken implications. At the grocer's, eyes met briefly and looked away. At the post office, parcels were passed with a little less cheer. Something had ruptured, though no one dared name it aloud. Miss Marple, however, was already several steps ahead. She stood before her kitchen table, examining the bracelet clasp she had found near the vicarage rosebed. The metal bore a delicate filigree, nothing extravagant, but lovingly crafted. A faint inscription on the underside caught the light, to A.T., with courage and love, not a gift from a husband, a gift from someone else. At 11:30, she visited Inspector Cray at the vicarage. The inspector, a tall man with a clipped moustache and eyes that missed little, greeted her with wary courtesy. "Miss Marple," he said, rising from his chair. "I expected you might visit." "I thought it best," she replied, "since we both find ourselves tending the same garden of weeds." Cray gestured toward the armchair by the fire. "I've just finished speaking with Mrs. Thorne, or perhaps I should say Miss Tregennis." She admitted it then, reluctantly. "She claims it's a past she buried long ago. New name, new life. No crime in that as far as I can see. But it begs the question, why hide it now?" Miss Marple folded her gloves in her lap. "Because someone remembered. Someone who wrote a letter without ink to remind her." Cray nodded. "I suspect the envelope wasn't the threat. It was the silence behind it. I found this." She placed the clasp gently on the desk. He examined it. From a bracelet. She wore it every day, except the afternoon of the garden party. Cray's brow furrowed. "You believe it was removed deliberately?" "I believe it was lost or torn during an encounter she hasn't mentioned." Cray exhaled, tapping the clasp against his thumbnail. "And who would she meet in secret near the rose-bed?" "That depends on who knows she isn't quite who she claims to be." As if summoned, the bell rang downstairs. Moments later, the maid showed in Mrs. Henshaw, face taut, eyes brimming with nervous energy. "I heard you've called for a formal inquiry," she said before anyone could speak. "I thought you'd want to hear what I saw." Cray gestured to a chair. "Please." Mrs. Henshaw did not sit. "I didn't want to speak out of turn," she began, voice brittle. "But the night of the garden party, I saw someone outside the vicarage, near the garden. They were standing quite still by the roses." "Who?" Cray asked. She hesitated. "It was Emily Fletcher." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever. "So slightly. She was holding something, a letter, I think. Then she dropped it. I saw her pick it up and hurry off." Cray scribbled the account into his notebook. "Why didn't you mention this before?" "I thought perhaps it meant nothing. But now—" She trailed off, wringing her hands. When she left, Cray turned to Miss Marple. "You believe her?" "I believe she saw what she saw," she replied, "but not necessarily what she thinks she saw. Emily Fletcher has motive. Perhaps not motive, but knowledge. And knowledge in this village can be just as dangerous." That afternoon, Miss Marple took a quiet stroll past the Whittaker house. Emily was in the garden, pruning petunias with distracted focus. "You're working hard, dear," Miss Marple called softly. Emily turned, startled. "Oh, Miss Marple, just keeping busy." Miss Marple leaned on the gate. "It's good for the nerves, I find. The hands know what to do, even when the mind's uncertain." Emily offered a faint smile. "I suppose." Miss Marple let the silence stretch before saying, "I wonder, Emily, did you ever meet Mrs. Thorne before she moved to the village?" "No, of course not. Curious, then, that she once lived only a few miles from your family's estate, in Cornwall. Before she became Mrs. Thorne, I mean." Emily's pruning slowed. "I didn't know that." "No, and yet she knew your name before you were introduced. Remarked, I believe, on your resemblance to your mother." Emily dropped the shears. Miss Marple continued gently. "You delivered something to her at the garden party, didn't you? Something from long ago." "I didn't." Miss Marple raised a hand. "I don't ask to accuse, only to understand." Emily's voice, when it came, was small. "She said I should never come, that I should forget, but I couldn't. I found the papers in my aunt's attic, the letters, my mother's handwriting, mentions of a woman who vanished. I only wanted to see if it was true. And the envelope, Orsu, thought if she saw the crest, she'd know who I was, that I knew." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "And did she?" Emily's eyes glistened. "She burned it. Didn't say a word. Just turned away like I was a stranger." "You must have frightened her, dear. People fear the past most when it returns in someone else's face." As Miss Marple left the garden, she noticed Mrs. Henshaw standing by the far hedge, not pruning, not tending, just watching. The web was tightening, not unravelling, and somewhere within it a truth still lay knotted, waiting to be pulled. Chapter 7. It was just past 9 on Tuesday morning when the scream broke across Gossamer Vale. Sharp, sudden, and unmistakably real, it shattered the stillness and drew curtains aside all along the high street. The sound had come from the vicarage. Miss Marple, already halfway through buttering her toast, set down her knife with deliberate calm. She reached for her shawl, fastened the front clasp, and stepped out into the quiet urgency rising like steam through the village lanes. By the time she reached the vicarage, a small crowd had gathered. Emily Fletcher stood near the garden gate, pale as chalk, hands pressed to her mouth. Inside the parlour, Inspector Cray loomed over the hearth, one hand resting lightly on the mantel, his face unreadable. Mrs. Thorne, Althea, sat rigid in a high-backed chair, her eyes vacant, her complexion waxen. But it was the room behind, her, the study, that held everyone's attention. The door had been left ajar. Cray turned as Miss Marple entered. "You're in time," he said quietly, "though I'd rather you hadn't needed to be." "What's happened?" He motioned her inside, past the staring faces, past Emily, who looked as though she might faint. The study was a small book-lined room overlooking the back garden. It smelled of dust and something else, something bitter, faintly metallic. Reverend Plumstead lay slumped over the writing desk. His spectacles rested askew, half fallen from his nose. One hand dangled limply toward the floor, while the other rested atop a blotting pad, its surface smeared with an inky scrawl. Nonsensical, broken lines, as though he'd tried to write something and failed. On the floor beside him, a shattered teacup, its contents forming a dark, spreading pool. Miss Marple's breath caught, quietly, inwardly. Cray gestured to the cup. "Mrs. Thorne says she brought him tea 20 minutes ago. Left it beside his sermon notes. When she returned, she found him like this." "Is he—" Cray shook his head. "Alive? Barely. But the doctor says it's consistent with a sudden reaction, possibly poisoning. We're having the tea residue tested." Miss Marple moved toward the desk. Her eyes flicked over the details. The half-written page, the ink bottle, the books stacked beside the lamp. A letter opener, clean and gleaming, a pocket Bible open to the Gospel of Luke. And beneath his arm, barely visible, a folded sheet of paper. She hesitated, then looked to Cray, who gave a silent nod. With gloved fingers, she gently eased it free. It was a single page, handwritten, the ink blotted but legible. A draft of a letter or a confession, though incomplete. "To whom it may concern, if anything happens to me, know that I tried to stop it. She came to me in confidence, said someone knew. Someone had found her out. There was a letter, but no name. I burned it, yes, but only to protect her." The rest trailed off into illegible scrawls. Miss Marple read it twice, lips pursed. The vicar had known more than he let on. He'd known of Althea's past, perhaps before the letter arrived, and he had tried, it seemed, to shield her from something, or someone. Cray rubbed his jaw. The cup was hers, she confirmed it, but whether she brought him poison or someone else used it. "She's not capable of murder," Miss Marple said softly. "Perhaps not," Cray murmured, "but someone in this house is." Outside, the sky had turned a steely shade of grey. Rain threatened the horizon. The garden, now cordoned by constables, had become a place of suspicion rather than sanctuary. Emily Fletcher sat alone on the stone bench beneath the rose trellis, her eyes fixed on the vicarage window. She flinched slightly as Miss Marple approached. He will survive," Miss Marple replied gently. But something was meant to silence him. Emily's hands gripped the edge of the bench. "She said I should never have come, that I'd stirred up things meant to stay buried." Miss Marple lowered herself beside her. "Perhaps, but secrets have roots, dear, and when left too long, they reach places one can't predict." Emily looked up. "Do you think she poisoned him?" Miss Marple's eyes softened. "I think someone wants us to believe that." Behind them, the church bell rang once, an echo of Sunday, but now stripped of reverence. Later that evening, as the village settled into its uneasy hush, Miss Marple stood at her window and opened the velvet pouch once more. The crest from the monogrammed letter, coiled serpent and thorned wreath, was clearer now. She traced it gently, then reached for a small wooden box tucked into the drawer beneath her sewing kit. Inside was an old newspaper clipping. Mysterious. Inheritance dispute in Tregennis family. Heir missing. A name was circled in pencil. Ruth Denholm, Tregennis. Not Althea, not Emily, a third woman, a link not yet placed. And as the rain began at last to fall, soft and cold against the windows of Gossamer Vale, Miss Marple whispered aloud, "Then who wrote the letter?" Chapter 8. Wednesday morning, the rain had passed, leaving Gossamer Vale washed clean, but only on the surface. Beneath the polished pavements and reswept thresholds, tension clung like damp wool. The vicar, still unconscious at the infirmary, had become a symbol of something no one could define. A crime with no name. A confession never finished. Miss Marple visited the vicarage again just after breakfast, under the pretext of delivering a basket of scones. She was greeted at the door, not by the maid, but by Mrs. Henshaw. That in itself was telling. "Oh," the woman said, blinking at the sight of her. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect—" "No one ever does," Miss Marple replied pleasantly, brushing raindrops from her shawl. "I heard Mrs. Thorne was receiving visitors again. Thought a bit of sweetness might help." Mrs. Henshaw hesitated. "She's resting. I've been keeping things tidy." "How good of you," Miss Marple said, "though I do wonder, do house guests typically tidy locked studies?" The silence that followed was brief but dense. "I needed to collect something she'd left behind," Mrs. Henshaw said tightly. "A personal note." "Oh? From her or to her?" "I don't believe that's your concern, Miss Marple." "Perhaps not, but what concerns one often concerns many in villages like ours, especially when poison appears in the tea." Mrs. Henshaw's jaw twitched, but she stepped aside. "If you insist." Miss Marple did not go directly to the sitting room. Instead, she paused in the hallway where the vicar's study door remained half-closed. She gestured at it. "Might I have another look? I never did get a good view of his writing desk." "I'm afraid that room is off-limits." "Curious," Miss Marple murmured. "How often people restrict access to places that were once public. Secrets do enjoy privacy." At that, Mrs. Thorne's voice floated faintly from the drawing-room. "Let her in." Mrs. Henshaw stiffened, then stepped aside. Amelia Thorne sat upright in her armchair, pale but composed. Her eyes were sharp once more. "I've been waiting," she said simply. Miss Marple approached, setting the basket down. "I imagine you have." Amelia's eyes flicked toward the closed study door. "I didn't poison him." "I know," Miss Marple said. "You're certain of that?" "I'm certain that if you'd intended to poison him, you wouldn't have delivered the cup yourself. Not after so carefully burning the letter days before. No, someone else tampered with that tea." Amelia gave a short, bitter laugh. "Then you're ahead of the police. I often am." A quiet moment passed between them. Then Miss Marple drew from her handbag a small envelope. Plain, unaddressed. "I wonder if you might look at this," she said. Amelia took it, confused. She opened it slowly and gasped. Inside was a second letter. Blank at first glance, but under the lamplight faint impressions shimmered, marks left behind by invisible ink. Below the surface, something waited to be revealed. "It's another letter," she whispered. "But I don't understand." Miss Marple leaned forward gently. "You didn't write this, and neither did Emily." Amelia's hand trembled. "I found this tucked inside the pocket of a coat," Miss Marple continued. "A coat belonging to Mrs. Henshaw, hidden poorly, almost carelessly, as if someone wanted it to be found. Just not yet." The door creaked. Both women turned to see Mrs. Henshaw standing in the hallway, her face pale, her mouth parted. "You shouldn't be in here," she said, voice tight. This is manipulation." Miss Marple rose calmly. "So is poison." "But you already knew that." Mrs. Henshaw stepped back. "You have no proof." "No? Then perhaps you'll explain this." Miss Marple reached into her bag and produced the silver bracelet clasp. "The soil where I found this was freshly turned, just beside the rosebed. You were seen there the evening of the garden party. Not Emily. You saw the first letter, knew what it meant. You confronted her, tried to wrest control of a truth you feared might surface. I never—" Amelia removed the bracelet during that encounter, likely out of distress. "You must have tried to hide it, but in your haste you missed the clasp. That was your mistake." Mrs. Henshaw's face crumpled. "She would have ruined everything. I kept her secret all these years. I protected her. And then the girl came, and the past came with her. You poisoned the vicar to silence him." "I only meant to frighten him. Just enough to stop him from telling the police about the inheritance." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Ah, so we return to Ruth Denholm Tregennis. The true heir. The letter wasn't a threat. It was a warning. Someone had learned that Amelia, Althea, was never the rightful recipient of her husband's estate." Mrs. Henshaw's voice dropped. "It wasn't about money. It was about survival. She needed a new name, a new life. I gave her that, protected her every step, and now you nearly killed an innocent man." Cray stepped through the doorway, arms folded. He had heard everything. Mrs. Henshaw stared at him for a moment, then sat down slowly on the armrest of a nearby chair. Miss Marple looked away, toward the window. Outside, the village continued in soft motion, unaware that the moment of revelation had finally arrived. But beneath that stillness, something deeper stirred, a reckoning long delayed, and Miss Marple, as always, had seen what others refused to look at: the quiet compulsions of guilt, the tangled debts of friendship, and the unrelenting pull of the past. Chapter 9. The drawing-room was still, the tension having settled like the final note of a long-forgotten melody. Mrs. Henshaw sat quietly now, no longer protesting, her eyes distant and her hands folded in her lap. Inspector Cray remained near the fireplace, arms crossed but no longer combative. Miss Marple stood beside the tea-trolley, her expression unreadable as she prepared a fresh pot, adding just a touch of milk to her own cup. The routine of the act lent weight to the stillness, as if, at last, the village's breath could be heard again. Amelia, no Althea, sat in her usual place, but no longer composed. Her gaze flickered between the two women. There was something in her face now that had not been there before. Relief, yes, but also a deep, aching weariness. "I didn't ask her to do it," Althea said at last, her voice hoarse. "I didn't even know what she had planned." "I believe you," Miss Marple replied gently. "But you must have known she would not let the past return without resistance. You placed your trust in someone whose loyalty was so complete, it became dangerous." "She saved me," Althea said. "Back then, when I left Cornwall, I had nothing, no name, no protection. She helped me become someone new." Miss Marple nodded, "And in doing so, she took on your fear as her own." He stepped forward. "We'll speak to Mrs. Henshaw formally. She's admitted to tampering with the tea. The vicar will recover in time." At this, Althea's eyes brimmed. "He tried to help me. I didn't deserve his kindness. I gave him lies." Miss Marple turned to her. "He knew, of course, far more than he let on, but kindness often includes silence." Althea blinked at that, then lowered her head. Cray cleared his throat and turned toward the door. "I'll arrange for her to be escorted. She's not to be treated unkindly." After he left with Mrs. Henshaw, the room sank into a hush once more. Miss Marple, still holding her teacup, stepped to the window. The rain had returned, soft now, barely more than a whisper on the glass. "You were Ruth's sister," she said quietly without turning. "Not her heir, but her shadow. The scandal in Cornwall, her disappearance, was never truly yours. She vanished, and you assumed the role left behind." Althea said nothing. "I only recognized it after seeing the crest again," Miss Marple continued. "The serpent and the thorns. It wasn't yours to bear. It was hers." Althea finally spoke, her voice low. "I never meant to steal anything. I only wanted to live. They would have destroyed me, our family, I mean. After Ruth vanished, there was no one left to claim the estate. I didn't know what else to do. And so, you changed your name, moved here, married Harold Thorne, and became respectable. I never expected the past to come looking for me." Miss Marple turned from the window. "It always does, usually in ways one doesn't anticipate. In this case, through Emily." Althea flinched. "I didn't know who she was. Not until she handed me that envelope." She had her mother's eyes and her questions. Althea looked away. "I thought if I ignored her, it would go away. But then the letter came, and the fear returned. Henshaw. She saw it, saw what it did to me. She believed she was protecting me. She nearly committed murder." "I know." Her voice broke. I didn't ask for it, but I didn't stop her either." There was silence for a moment, save the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Then Miss Marple spoke once more, gently. "Emily must be told the truth, not for revenge, but for clarity. Her mother's disappearance, your deception, it all rests on broken pieces that she alone carries." Althea nodded slowly. "Will you help me?" Miss Marple set her teacup down. "If she agrees to come." That afternoon, at Miss Marple's request, Emily Fletcher was invited to the vicarage under the simple premise of conversation. She arrived cautiously, her green coat buttoned all the way to the collar despite the humidity. She sat, stiff and uncertain, across from Althea. The silence was long. Then, "I wasn't sure I'd come," Emily said. "But Miss Marple said there were things I needed to hear." Althea's hands trembled as she reached for the edge of the shawl in her lap. "I'm not the woman you thought I was," she said, "and I may never have been. But I knew your mother, and I loved her." Emily's face twisted, pain flickering just beneath the surface. "She vanished," she whispered. "No one ever explained. They said scandal, madness. I found the letters, years later, hidden in an attic, mentions of someone named Althea, and a place she might have gone. I wasn't brave enough to tell the truth," Althea said, "so I built a new life around the lie." Emily looked down at her hands, then up again. Why did she write the letter? "Why now? I believe," Miss Marple said, stepping forward at last, "someone else wrote it. Perhaps someone who knew the truth from a distance. A solicitor, perhaps. Or someone in the old village. They wanted to test the waters, see if Althea would reveal herself when pressed. And she nearly did," Emily murmured. Miss Marple nodded. "But in this village, secrets unravel not through force, but through time, tea, and talk." Jude. 3 women sat quietly together for a long while, saying little. By dusk, the first candle was lit, and outside beyond the hedge, the last clouds of the storm slipped away, leaving the village not quite cleansed, but no longer cloaked. Chapter 10. The next morning broke with quiet clarity. For the first time in a week, Gossamer Vale felt still in a way that wasn't ominous. It was the stillness that follows a long illness, or the final line of a difficult letter, the peace that comes not from comfort, but from completion. Miss Marple sat in the parlour of her cottage, a modest fire crackling in the grate despite the warming air. On the table beside her lay a small sheaf of notes, a folded newspaper, and the now familiar silver clasp, polished and oddly innocent-looking in the morning light. Inspector Cray sat across from her, sipping tea from a cup he had not yet set down. His posture remained attentive, but there was no longer tension in his shoulders. "I must admit," he said, "this one unravelled slower than I expected." Miss Marple smiled softly. "Because it wasn't really a murder mystery. It was a story about memory, and how far some people go to protect it." She reached for the clasp, turning it gently in her fingers. The first thread was the bracelet. Amelia Thorne, Althea Tregennis, always wore it, until the garden party. Its sudden absence wasn't fashion. It was dislodged during a confrontation, one she did not confess to. Cray nodded. "With Mrs. Henshaw?" "Yes. Or more accurately, Mrs. Henshaw confronted her, perhaps about the letter, or about the arrival of Emily. It's likely she recognized the monogram, or perhaps sensed Althea's growing panic. Either way, something was exchanged in the rose garden. The bracelet lost, the first real trace of what had been hidden. And the letter itself, Cray asked. A copy, possibly written by a distant solicitor, or even a family acquaintance, in Cornwall, testing the waters. It bore no direct accusation, only a symbol, the crest, enough to frighten someone with something to hide. She placed the clasp back down, reaching instead for the notes. Then came the second letter, the one planted in Mrs. Henshaw's coat. A poor hiding place, likely done in haste. But the key detail lies in how she used the letter, not to expose Althea, but to deflect suspicion. She directed attention toward Emily. Convenient scapegoat, Cray murmured. Indeed, a nervous, curious girl, with no social standing and too many questions. Mrs. Henshaw knew Emily had come looking for answers. And so she stoked the suspicion, subtly at first, a comment here, a sighting there, and then the tea. Miss Marple paused. She feared the vicar would speak. His unfinished note confirmed it. He knew about Althea's past and tried to manage it quietly. But Mrs. Henshaw, sensing the walls closing in, used the one tool she had left. Fear. Poison. Yes, but likely a non-lethal dose. Enough to induce collapse. Enough to silence, not to kill. Cray sighed, glancing toward the hearth. She underestimated just how much a body can endure. Miss Marple gave a slight nod, as people often do. She leaned forward now, voice quiet, precise. But the most telling clue was not the clasp or the letters. It was Mrs. Henshaw's behaviour. She claimed to protect Althea, but control often disguises itself as protection. She did not act to save her friend. She acted to preserve the version of the story she helped write. Cray was silent for a moment. Then, you never doubted it was her. I doubted everyone. That's rather the point. But guilt speaks through silence and through overcompensation. She volunteered information too readily. She was the first to cast suspicion. And most tellingly, she tried to destroy evidence no one had yet asked about. Cray leaned back in his chair. It's a peculiar case. No body, no murder. And yet every piece fits together as if someone had died. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. Because something did die, she said softly. A name, a life, a constructed piece. What unravelled here was not a murder, but a myth. And that can be just as dangerous. Outside, a blackbird trilled from the hedge. The world, it seemed, had already moved on. Later that day, Miss Marple returned to the vicarage. Amelia was in the drawing-room, seated near the window, a shawl draped over her shoulders. I'm not sure what happens next, she said, as Miss Marple entered. There may be consequences. There always are, Miss Marple replied. But there is also truth now, and perhaps forgiveness. Emily entered a few minutes later. She did not sit immediately, but stood behind the chair across from her, mother's sister, no longer a stranger, but something not yet defined. I'm not leaving, she said quietly, but I'm not staying here either. Althea nodded slowly. I wouldn't ask you to. Miss Marple stepped back, watching, the two women in silence. In the firelight, shadows moved across the edges of the room, not threatening, just reminders of what had once been hidden, and now, at last, had been seen. Chapter 11. The week that followed, the rhythms of Gossamer Vale resumed with almost theatrical determination. Church bells rang again at their usual hour. Mrs. Maplecroft reopened her knitting circle, though she avoided eye contact when discussing the vicarage, and the tea shop served rhubarb tarts with a polite smile, as though no scandal had ever brewed between sips. But those who lived in the heart of it, those who had touched the truth, moved more quietly now. Mrs. Henshaw had been taken to a convalescent facility just outside of Oakminster. Charges were likely, though not yet filed. The inspector had described her state as fragile, but not unrepentant. Her statement had been thorough, painfully so. She confessed not only to poisoning the vicar's tea with a mild digitalis extract, harvested from foxglove in her own garden, but to burning correspondence she believed could undo everything she had protected. Miss Marple had read the transcript. One line in particular had stood out. "You don't know what it's like to love someone enough to lie for them every day of your life." She had underlined it, then closed the file. At the vicarage, Reverend Plumstead had returned home under strict instruction to rest. His convalescence had become a symbol of something broader in the village, a quiet recovery from a wound most could not name, but all had sensed. Miss Marple visited him late on a Thursday afternoon, bearing a jar of lemon preserves and a short volume of Keats. "You're very good," the vicar said, smiling weakly, "though I suspect you came for conversation rather than verse." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "The two are often linked, I find. Poetry has a way of telling the truth, gently." He tilted his head. "So does gardening. And detective work, I suppose." A pause. "I failed her, you know," he said suddenly. "Althea, I thought I could hold the truth in place, keep it from unspooling." "No one ever holds it forever," Miss Marple said softly. "Only delays it." Outside, the sky had begun to fade into soft purples. A breeze drifted through the window, carrying the scent of wet stone and early jasmine. "She'll leave, I imagine," the vicar added. "She hasn't said so, but the village has a long memory." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "but not always a cruel one." Althea had not yet made her decision public, but her bags were packed. A single valise near the front door. The bracelet was gone, buried perhaps, or quietly discarded. She had taken to walking early in the morning, before the streets filled, moving like someone trying to memorize the shape of a place they once called home. As for Emily Fletcher, she had begun writing, not letters, but pages. Pages filled with questions and gaps and memories she was still arranging. She came to Miss Marple's cottage once, near dusk, to return a borrowed scarf. She lingered by the hearth. "I thought she might be my mother," she said quietly. "Althea, for a moment I really thought Miss Marple looked up from her embroidery. She was part of your mother's life, but not the piece you were looking for." "No," Emily said, "but she was something, and maybe that's enough." The following Sunday, Althea stood at the edge of the churchyard after service, watching the villagers disperse. Most avoided her gaze. A few nodded stiffly, Only Miss Hartnell, after a long pause, offered her a piece of paper folded neatly in half. It was a recipe for gooseberry fool. Nothing more was said. Miss Marple, watching from beneath the yew tree, allowed herself the smallest smile. Later that day, a letter arrived from the solicitor in Cornwall. The handwriting was precise, the contents brief. Miss Ruth Denholm Tregennis was officially declared deceased in 1927. No claimant ever stepped forward. The estate was sold, proceeds distributed as per probate. No further dispute exists. Miss Marple read it twice. There would be no legal scandal, no titles reclaimed, only the echo of a life lived in shadow, and another still deciding what it meant to step into light. And still, the letter without ink remained the heart of it all. Not what it said, but that it existed. A message sent in silence, speaking volumes, to those who already knew. Miss Marple returned the envelope to her writing desk. She did not destroy it. Some mysteries, after all, were not meant to be erased, but simply understood. Outside, the bells tolled softly again. The village had resumed its shape, but something beneath its hedgerows and tea-tables had shifted, ever, so slightly, yet permanently. Chapter 12. The final days of summer came slowly to Gossamer Vale, settling in golden slants across hedges and drawing long, drowsy shadows across the cobbled square. Life had resumed with the rhythm only English villages knew, where scandal softened into anecdote, and truth, once uncovered, tucked itself discreetly behind lace curtains and flower boxes. At her cottage on Church Lane, Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, the afternoon sun warming the polished surface. Before her lay a parcel, modestly wrapped in brown paper and string. She untied it carefully. Inside, a plain notebook. On the first page, in neat handwriting. Collected notes. Neendete. Tregennis case. E.F. Emily Fletcher's handwriting. Clear. A touch sharp at the edges, but steadier than it had been. A subtle message, too. She wasn't running. She was staying, at least for now. And she was writing, assembling the scattered shards of her mother's story and her own. Miss Marple turned the page and read the first paragraph. It was not clever, not dramatic, but it was honest. And that, she thought, was more than enough. She set the notebook gently aside and walked out to her small garden. The roses were climbing higher this year, as if reclaiming their place. Beneath them, the soil had settled where the bracelet clasp had once lain. There was a soft knock at the gate. Amelia Thorne stood there. No longer the vicar's wife, no longer the quiet fixture of parish life, but not a fugitive either. Her posture was less rigid now, her eyes no longer guarded. "I'm leaving tomorrow," she said simply. "A cousin in Kent has offered me a room. Nothing grand." Miss Marple opened the gate. "Tea first, I think." They sat on the garden bench, each holding a cup, the silence between them companionable. "I told the inspector everything," Amelia said, "even the part about Ruth. And the papers I forged. There won't be charges. He said it's too far past." Miss Marple nodded. "The truth has a statute of limitations," she murmured. "But not conscience. That tends to linger." Amelia looked away. "I never meant for it to end like this. I only wanted a life, a name. I never imagined it would catch me up again." "Things with roots often do," Miss Marple said, sipping gently. "Even the ones we try to prune." There was a pause. "I wrote Emily," Amelia said. "A real letter this time. Ink and all. She hasn't replied." "She will," Miss Marple said, "but perhaps not with words." As if summoned, a voice called faintly from the gate. Emily stood there, holding something small and square. "I thought," she said, "you might want this back." She extended a folded paper, the original blank envelope from the garden party, the one that had started everything. Althea took it, holding it like something fragile. "I never did find out who wrote it," Emily added. Amelia shook her head. "Nor did I. Maybe no one. Maybe it was just time." Emily hesitated, then added, "If you're ever near Oakminster, there's a bookshop there I like. You could write." "I will," Amelia said quietly. They stood for a moment, the distance between them no longer quite so sharp. Then Emily turned and left. No dramatic farewells, no sudden reconciliations. Just the quiet understanding of two lives that had intersected, if only for a moment, at the point of truth. Miss Marple walked Amelia back to the gate. "She'll come round," she said softly. "I don't expect her to. That's why she might." When Amelia had gone, Miss Marple returned to her chair beneath the elm. A breeze stirred the edge of the tablecloth. The teacups had gone cool. She reached once more for the envelope Emily had returned. Turning it over in her hands, she examined the faint shimmer of the inkless inscription. The writing had always been strange, elegant, deliberate, but something else occurred to her now. The pressure of the strokes, the narrow curve of the S, the slant of the final letter. Not Emily's, not Amelia's, not Mrs. Henshaw's either. Miss Marple smiled faintly. It had been the vicar, a letter written not to threaten, but to warn. A silent plea to confront the past before it turned destructive. A shepherd's instinct, delivered in secrecy, but, like all secrets, never truly invisible. She folded the envelope and placed it between the pages of her gardening diary, marking it not as evidence, but as memory. Then she stood, stretched, and returned to her rose bushes. The dead stems needed trimming. The roots were holding, and the next bloom would come soon.